right. Hello. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Dan. I'm one of the co-founders of Pistol Shrimp, working on the sequel to the Ur-Quan Masters, Children of Infinity.
I'm
Fred?
Fred, likewise a co-founder of Pistol Shrimp and co-founder of Toys for Bob, who made Ur-Quan Masters and many other games, but we're not going to talk about those today.
Hi, I'm Mark Yohalem. I'm one of the co-founders of Wormwood Studios and the almost lifelong fan of the Ur-Quan Masters, I guess, since my childhood, a fan of it. Really grateful to the opportunity to meet you guys and talk about your games and our games.
Cool.
Don't make
Yeah.
me feel old. That's all I ask.
No, that's my job. Don't worry about it, Mark. I'll do it. Well, lifelong, come on, you can do better than that. What about before your life started? You weren't a fan. We've failed. No, but jokes aside, how did you find the Ur-Quan Masters? You said lifelong, so okay, you must have discovered it somehow. What was that experience like for you?
Well, so I was born in 1980. When I was however old is appropriate for this to have come out, Starflight came out. I played Starflight at a friend's house, and then later played part of Starflight 2, which Fred, I think you were involved in. Am I right in Starflight 2?
Um, Not so much. Paul was,
Oh,
I
okay.
mean,
I remember one of
Greg Johnson had an office right next to ours, so we cross-pollinated often in each other's games. And Greg had a lot of input on Ur-Quan Masters, and we definitely helped him on Toe Jam and Earl and some of the other things that he's done. He's a brilliant designer. So yeah, there was a lot of cross-pollination going on.
But I played Starflight both on a PC and on the Sega Genesis, and then there was nothing. I loved space opera games, but the other ones really didn't scratch that itch at all. In particular, they didn't have the sense of exploration coupled with narrative. You had ones like Elite that had exploration, you had ones like Wing Commander that had narrative, but there wasn't the same marriage of the two. And as a result, none that to me had the feel of the space operas in literature and film and television. And then I played the first of your games, and could not understand the strategy layer at all. I mean, to this day, I still can't. I've tried it many times. I've come back like,
It's,
what is the Star Fortress even doing? But the melee mode became intensely addictive with me and my friends. The number of bruises from keyboard jamming, which was because it can only detect 4 keys at once. So inevitably, everyone is turning, accelerating, and trying to shoot at the same time. And so someone is getting jammed always,
oh,
screaming,
you,
smacking you, or you limp at someone until they couldn't turn at all, and then just chip away at their health. The expletives, you never just said that someone was cheaping or cheating. It was always some expletive came first. Um, so we loved that game. It also did not have a sense of exploration, but it had a promise. When you read the manual, when you look at the ship stuff, there is this sense that am I playing a shareware game where it's going to unlock into something else? And then Ur-Quan Masters comes out, and there may be 5 or 6 games that to me, like, it's hard to envision an improvement upon it. Maybe you had better mouse controls or something, but like it really was unparalleled. We played that game, first of all, Super Melee. I probably clocked 1,000 hours. Every sleepover, we would play Super Melee and a shareware game called Gladiator, also had key jamming issues, and we'd play it for hours and hours and hours. But we would also replay the game, even though we knew how to win it, because every time you play, you discover, oh my God, there is not just a little bit more here. it's like you could play that game radically differently if you took different routes through it. And no matter what you did, it had not just as a game, but as a work of art of space opera. It sets the mold for me. So, we played it right around the time Babylon 5 came out. People talk about, did Babylon 5, was it inspired by the doctrinal conflict? Maybe. I mean, there's a lot of common sources that lead people to the same place. But to me, this idea of like space opera as an epic in which there are different aliens with really distinctive, not just rubber face aliens, a sense of history that is galactic in scale, not just local in scale. All of that, to me, is space opera. And it turns out there are not actually very many works that embody it, one of which is Ur-Quan Masters. And so after playing it, after playing Starflight, I'd always wanted to make a space opera game. After playing Ur-Quan Masters, I was like, what's the point? It's like the platonic ideal has been reached. It cannot be improved upon. And so, yeah, but it made me realize what you can do in game design. And then one last thing I've talked for a long time, but one last thing I want to just specifically call out is in the manual, there was something like the appendix in D&D that described the works that inspired Gygax, and you guys had the same thing. And that also shaped how I work as a game developer in two respects. One is when I want to create something in a genre, I try to consume everything I can in that genre, because I think part of the implicit relationship we have with the player is the player is coming to play, to immerse themselves in the thing that they normally only get to read. Like I read Timothy Zahn's Shadow of the Conqueror. I want to play Shadow of the Conqueror. Okay, what game can give me the feeling that I'm now playing that? And to understand what those expectations are, I realized you really have to just immerse yourself in the genre. So everything thereafter, when we made Primordia, I read every robot book I could find, watched all the robot movies I could find. When I was working on a space opera, I read 150 space opera novels, watched a bunch. And the Genesis, and for Fallen Gods, I've read all of the Icelandic sagas, many versions of the Norse myths, all that stuff. That's all because of that one page in the manual, and thinking this is the method that these amazing creators used to capture a feeling that nothing else is captured. So anyway, long answer.
Yeah, I don't know that we were so intentional about, we just loved science fiction and we read it, and that led us to not know how to make it, but to have an idea of what we wanted to make. But we didn't start from your direction, which was, I guess, to kind of consume a section of anything and then make a game about it. It wasn't intentional, but yes, we do owe a lot to the amazing authors that came before us.
Well, am I allowed to pose questions to you all?
Oh, sure.
That's why you're here. We're it's just me and Fred stuck in a room most of the time. You got to break up the monotony.
So this is a sort of a two-parter question. So to me, a reason why Ur-Quan Masters cannot be improved upon relates to resource gathering. So the game existed at a technological moment in time where the Landers mini game, where you go down and collect minerals, does not come across as cartoony and stylized. It comes across as sort of mimetic for what a commander might be seeing on a view screen or something like that. But from a gameplay standpoint, it is very simple. it is easy to understand and has a little bit of an arcadey dimension that makes it fun, even though it is fairly grindy. Everything subsequent, when trying to tackle this problem, has gone in one of two directions, neither of which is satisfying. There is the simulationist direction, which is like, why is it actually that there is one ship in the whole galaxy that is gathering resources? That doesn't make any sense. We're going to come up with a very complicated system of epicycles to justify it. And then the actual gameplay is going to be something realistic. So I put into this category like the probe system in Mass Effect. They were clearly trying to make it not seem absurd. It's not remotely fun compared to the resource gathering in Ur-Quan Masters. The second is to say, it's meant to be an arcade sequence. It's meant to be fun. Let's just make this something that's an arcade game. I would put into that category, I'm trying to think what the best example is. There was Daedalic had a space opera game where you had like a lunar lander sequence that was the equivalent of it. Those, I think, and other, shall not be named space opera games have taken a more sort of Mario Galaxy type feel to the resource gathering. The problem with that is that it completely undermines the space opera epic tenor of the narrative. Even though Ur-Quan Masters was not, buttoned down in all respects, there's a lot of humor and lightheartedness. It still is fundamentally a pretty serious and epic story that breaks down when it's like, now you're gonna float around a pinball-sized planet, vacuuming up resources or something. So that's the only game I have found that I think may have pulled off the balance is a game called Crying Suns, incidentally inspired in part by Primordia, apparently, where they have these sort of red shirt lander missions that I think sort of do it. But what is your answer as you guys are going forward? You're making a new game. How are you going to thread that needle?
Well, you might be interested in. I'll tell you how we threaded the needle back then, which maybe doesn't bear on how we're threading it this time, but it's kind of a similar experience in many ways this time. But so back then I actually coded up and Paul designed sort of landing parties where you would compose your lander's crew out of aliens that were your allies on your ship, and based on which alien was sort of the leader of the landing party, you would have certain characteristics that your landing party was better or worse at. And that just devolved into a lot of bookkeeping, and it was kind of taking agency away from the player. So, the player's job was just to kind of compose this landing party, and then things would happen based on that. And we just said, this isn't fun. This isn't fun. It would be much more fun to have the player actually driving the lander on the planet and doing simple but fun things rather than bookkeeping the landing party. And so that's, I threw out a bunch of work for landing parties to make that change, but we think it was a worthwhile change. And the whole grindy thing is true. It is a grind. And many people say, get rid of mining completely because I don't like that grind. And many people like that. The balance we were always trying to find, though, was we really wanted you to start the game overwhelmed by the universe. Not only overwhelmed by what you didn't know, but just your ship's not very good. Nothing's nothing's working right. It's working, but it's not working right. And we wanted you to, at least in the early fall experience, have a little bit of success sort of improving your lot, but recognize that it could be improved much more, and then give you some breadcrumbs to go out into into the world and suffer a little bit, not not cruelly, but just when you did finally get that flagship that had the fusion blasters and the the point defense, and you were basically unbeatable at that point, that you would have appreciated the journey to get there.
I mean, this is what makes the game so great. I mean, one, I could and have talked for hours and hours about the things that I think are so great. One of them is that starting premise of the game, which is how do you answer in a space opera why it is that there is anything left to explore? Because if there are civilized, aliens that have been in contact with each other, I mean, sure, maybe they're holding back some secrets on their maps, but basically, we already have a map of space in 2024. And if we had, it's that the notion that you wouldn't know where things are, the notion that you'd be the only one doing anything when you're dealing with a scale of trillions or maybe hundreds of billions of sentient beings. But somehow you guys came up with, like, it is a perfect starting premise for why one captain can be the fulcrum, right? Within the Alliance of Free Stars, the explanation is there is no one else. They lost the war, they got shellacked, everyone's been slave shielded, so they can't be helping out. And those who aren't slave shielded are under restrictive laws of their overlords. And so you're the only one who can actually do anything for them. And then you have the doctrinal conflict, which is a not quite balanced, but fairly balanced conflict, so that one side, you can come in and tip the balance. The only other game I think I'd say Fallout, the first Fallout, accomplished this. There's a independent RPG called The Age of Decadence that I feel has accomplished this. But one question I have again for your next game is, like, how do you do it again? It can't be we all got slave shielded 7 times. Shit, it keeps happening. Like, what, and maybe this is already in your publicity material, or alternatively, maybe you're not disclosing it. But have you found an answer to that question to make it work?
I guess you never really know until players experience it whether you found an answer to that. But we already have, Paul has already written the overarching plot, and we're satisfied with it. I guess that's how I can answer it.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah, would be a little less we could be a little more specific, but we actually haven't disclosed that, and we're kind of, for now anyway, playing that a little close to our chest. But I can talk about, at least to your earlier question of like, how do you thread the needle, and I can say I agree with you. Actually, I think one of my favorite parts of the Ur-Quan Masters is just the first 10 minutes. The setup of it is really excellent in the sense that things make sense. I care about what's going on, and who I am is established very quickly. Why am I special is established very quickly. And oh my gosh, there's a lot going on here is understood, even if it's not all said directly to me. The elements really gel together in a nice way. So just to, like, as speaking as a creative person, the only way we can succeed is to not compete with ourselves. We can't do that again, even in your words. You're like, well, there's not another doctrinal conflict. Okay, like, look, you dealt with that problem in the first game. So we can't just do that again. Like, oh, it's like, no, they're like Scooby-Doo villains. Like, oh, they're back. Here they go. That's not what happened. But I think what, just from a creative standpoint, regardless of, like, yes, we do want to play something close to our chest, partly because we're still learning. And like what Fred said, we don't really know if we succeeded until it gets out there. We have the story kind of underpinnings of it, but like truly it's a game. It's what's the player's experience of that is really the important question. And I'll be honest, like you know, we're not done with that. And I think it's one of, my experience in games is the beginning of the game tends to be the last thing you wind up doing because you don't, the middle is easy. It's the like, oh, well, how do I the beginning has a lot of stakes on it. That's that's the riskiest part of the game. When a player can drop the game, it's like, well, if they're not having fun in 5 minutes, I got another game in my Steam library. I'll go play that.
Yeah.
So, the kind of short and trite, oh, easier said than done answer is, not competing with ourselves, but focusing really on, that player experience, which is how's the player going to appreciate what they care about or what we want them to care about in the first, 5 minutes. And it can't be the same thing. It has to be a little different because I don't think it'll work. We jump higher than that. I'm not going to say is impossible, but it feels very hard to even have a measuring stick in the same direction. So a slightly different direction to help help make it engaging, I think is kind of where we're leaning.
I mean, so one of the things, Fred, you said about wanting the player to feel overwhelmed in a sense at the start with how weak you are and how small you are in the scale of the game. That is one of the, again, I'm not just going to puff you guys for the whole talk.
It's fine.
This is one of the great, I just think, great moments in video games. And I don't know, are you guys familiar with an interactive fiction writer named Adam Cadre? He made a game called Photopia as his most famous game. He doesn't make games anymore. He has a blog now. Photopia is another one of those games that I think is very hard to make a better thing as it is. He also writes a lot about books and movies, and he loves the movie Tron, and this uses Tron as an example where you already think you are at 10, and then something goes so much above 10 that you realize you get almost vertigo. The moment he describes in that is that when he was a kid watching the first time, the female protagonist is so beautiful. She has the helmet on, and then she takes the helmet off, and she has these beautiful flowing hair, and it's like she's even more beautiful than she was before. For me, that moment happens at the start of Ur-Quan Masters, is that you get a signal from Pluto, which is the farthest out point within the solar system, and it takes a while to get there because the intrastellar movement in the game is fairly slow. And so, you have no idea. Nowadays, every player knows exactly what every game is going to be because there's YouTube trailers and articles. But I came to that game having no expectations. And so it's like, okay, I played it Solar Winds. I don't know if you guys have played that game. Solar Winds is always in the same exploration scale. And it takes a long time to get from place to place. So I kind of had a sense, okay, this is what exploration is going to be. Slowly traveling interstellar, and then suddenly you leave the solar system, and it's like, oh, forget how far away Pluto is. That was one millionth of an astronomical unit compared to everything else, and that sense of vertigo is one of my favorite parts of the game. Again, something I think it's hard. You can't go back literally to the same thing. And players' expectations are different now, but that is one of my favorite parts of the start of
the music too. The hyperspace music. Yeah.
Well, when the Ur-Quan probe gets there, particularly, so I played both the DOS version, which had no voice acting, and then there was a fan. One of the great things you all did was permit the fan remake that maybe you did or did not permit it. But my understanding, it was loosely permitted that there was a freeware Ur-Quan Masters.
We dropped the source code on them.
Yeah, and that one took the 3DO voice acting and put it on the PC. So when I experienced that the first time, because it's like you pull out of the intro dialogue sequence, something is flying right at you, and you're like, what the hell is this? And then the music hits. That music is dun 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 dun. And so first the fact something's flying at you is you're taken aback. Then that music hits you, and before you can even cope with the music, it's an unauthorized intruder. Like, it's just such a great, and the visuals are so great. I mean, it is one of those games that shows um, that games they are greater than some of their parts, but they are also require success on all these disciplines, because that sequence wouldn't be what it was without the writing. It also wouldn't be without what it was without design, without the music, without the art, and in the 3DO case, without the voice acting. All of those things come together. So I guess with your current project, it's much easier to have a larger collaboration. How are you guys striking the balance between meeting modern expectations, but also keeping the team small enough that it has that personal element that Ur-Quan Masters is also very obviously an autorial is too pretentious, but it has individual human beings, souls and characters are evident in the game as well, in a way that on a big corporate title, that's not always the case.
Yeah. That's a big question. I mean, Dan's been doing most of the game design. I'm mostly the engineer, although back then I was engineer and in-game designer, as Paul would direct me. But now that we have tools, I don't necessarily need to do the in-game design anymore. But he's had to I wouldn't say struggle, but he's had to deal with both changing expectations and basically changing expectations of gamers. And he could speak to that.
Yeah, I have this. This is not a joke. I have a 25-page draft answer to that question, which I'm not done with. I haven't finished answering yet. It is that question you asked. I mean, Fred said that's a doozy, and I would say that is I'm not gonna be trite and say, well, that is the question to answer, right? If we answer that, then it's gonna be a great game. But for me, the way I approach things, like I'm gonna not answer your question, but you'll see how it is an answer to your question, which is if people are having fun, they won't ask questions. So it's sort of like if you give them a box in which they get to ask questions that's engaging and fun, and you put it in front of them, they're going to be thinking, oh my gosh, I have questions about the thing you've given me. Right. A big challenge of what you're talking about is, and it is the challenge, truly managing expectations for, there are people who played a game that's 30, over 30 years old now, or maybe they played it at different ages. I played it myself, I played Super Melee a bunch as a kid. My joke, which everybody knows at this point, and maybe people are tired of hearing, is I didn't know there was a story. I was just like, this is a cool space combat game. My friends and I played space combat. And then I would start working at Toys for Bob, and someone's like, I think it was actually Chris Nelson, who was part of the original open source endeavor, is like, you got to play this. The story's great. And I said, what story? And so, that's just kind of my cheeky way of saying, I didn't encounter it until I was a modern player, right? I didn't play it when it was a contemporary game. It was just like, look, I love Game of Eddie era. As far as I'm concerned, there are things that are, I don't want to say timeless, but I can appreciate things that are of their time. And there's a lot of the Ur-Quan Masters that is of its time. But a few things, Fred said this a lot too in some of these talks, but a few things that I focus on, I'm a gameplay person. I will play a game with terrible writing, terrible story if I'm having fun. I can forgive that. The inverse is not true. If you have the best writing in the world, but I hate interacting with the game, I can't keep going, right? I have to really motivate myself, right? And that's just me giving a little bit of cheek. But really, it is, the way this is an answer to your question, and I hope it's a satisfying answer, is the personal touch is even me just saying that and saying, well, if the player's having fun and I want the player to have fun, and that is the core goal, and I have an actual visual diagram of why will the player have fun with this, or what kind of fun do we want to give? Because it's not a horror game, it's not a first person shooter. There's a lot of things it's not, but one aspect of it that's really important to me is just nobody's going to be asking questions if you're giving them answers to things that are like, why am I having fun? Why am I here? Why do I want to do this? Why do I want to land on a planet's surface? What's the point of you? It's interesting you brought the lander one. That's we could have a whole talk about that. We didn't even talk about sort of, oh, how are we approaching it for the new one? But I'm having fun. That's what matters. The questions won't be as ominous if I'm busy having fun, or not ominous. I won't have room in my head for them. The other part of it is, Fred's brought this up a lot, which is Ur-Quan Masters was made, originally released at a time when, I mean, look, game genres still suck. I don't know what the difference between an adventure and an action adventure, like none of this stuff makes any sense.
The
They're
game
just
was sold as an adventure game. Because I've had this discussion with it when people are debating genre limits. The box says a brand new adventure game.
Yeah, but it's an RPG. It's totally an RPG. If I
Right.
look at it, I'm like, it's an RPG. But in any case, the notion of just genres, and yes, we could have a whole hilarious discussion on genres, and I liken it to metal genres, where I think there's someone sitting there trying to make up new genres as their goal. They're not trying to make music; they just want to make genres. And so, I like metal. I'm not teasing anyone, but the Ur-Quan Masters existed as a non-genre game, but part of that was a factor of the time it was made, when it's like, well, it's an adventure game. It is an adventure game. Right now, if I were to market, I'm going to play an adventure game, well, I would expect like Primordia, right? That's a good example.
Right.
Like, I think I'm going to get that. If you told me it's an adventure game, cool. Otherwise, like, it's, oh, but I'm moving around. Oh, it's like Dear Esther. Oh, that's a walking simulator. That's different. So this sort of kind of like genreification thing, I would say, for me personally, working on this, that could be a marketing term, but from a creation standpoint, and this is true to the spirit of how Ur-Quan Masters was made, and Fred, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it's what would be fun here and what makes sense, and how do we put those things together? And even just like having a little bit of marketing mindset on like, what do the last 5 years of games look like, of really successful games? They're not necessarily games that painted in the box and that took their genre and said, I am the genre, I'm going to hold on to it. They're games that said, you know what, I'm sick of the genreification. I'm going to pull what I liked. You're talking about author, like books we read. Granted, Fred and I both still read a lot of sci-fi, and I have my sci-fi inspirations when I'm working on this that live very front of mind. But let's take all the stuff I love and put it here. And by just the act of creation, it becomes personal. And so to actually try to steer it towards an answer to your question, it's like the personal touch is because we're bringing that personal touch into our creation and saying, well, I want to like take the clay and put it in my hands and be able to do that, but not exactly know what the finished product is going to look like. And it's like, it can't be like the Ur-Quan Masters in the sense of, oh, I'm going to copy every pixel. I'm going to copy the screen layout, all that kind of stuff. It can be when that makes sense, right? Look, it's like, if I want to say, well, this should be a retro game. So therefore, because it's a retro game, I'm going to make these choices. It's much more nuts and bolts, which is the gameplay top-down? Yes. Okay, because it's top-down gameplay, that provides certain conventions and rules and things we can leverage. Is it being top-down because it needs to be like Ur-Quan Masters, and that's how Ur-Quan Masters was? No, it's top-down because that lets us create a limited, set of restrictions that let us make gameplay. And I don't know, it's hard for me to make any games without restrictions.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I did get that impression, when playing it, was that, throughout there had been this question, what would be fun? Striking, in fact, the final battle has elements that are absent from the rest of the game. And even when I was playing as a kid, it certainly felt to me like someone just said, can't we just throw something new in so that this feels categorically different from, I wouldn't have said categorically, but I don't want it to just feel like a normal melee battle against someone with a bigger health bar. I want this to feel like it's something fundamentally different. And that, like, most games don't do that, right? Most games, it's they've already got the parameters in place. So the boss battle is going to be a tweak on the formula, but not a new formula in that way.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we definitely wanted you to feel this is a different experience because it was their big bad trophy that they were fighting over and stuff. So
Yeah,
Um,
one nice thing, like just to use that as an example, and like speaking of how do we use modern tastes and modern conventions and things to leverage some of that, it is making, I mean, I don't mean to puff up my chest and say like, aha, everything is easy, because game development is hard. But right now, we have tools. The way, if we needed to make 10 Sumatras, we can now. It's not like a huge reach if we want to make the game about beating 10 hard bosses, right? And you could tell a whole story just about that. There's the 10 fleet, the fleet of whatever, I'm just totally making this up. Seriously, this is not part of the game. I'm just making this up. But the fleet of whatever, and you have to defeat these 10 boss battles. We have modern tools. We have things that let us prototype and test and create things that are fun. And I've been doing like live development streams, and we have more ships than we can even use because it's so easy and fast to prototype a ship and say, that's a lot of Fred's work, right? Is building the tools that we're using to kind of be the backbone of the game. And so if we want to insert that stuff and we want to know, oh, what do we need here? What should that be? Can be a much easier question to answer now than it used to be. And well, in my opinion, because we can try it really fast. And so, our Super Melee prototype has, I hope I'm not guessing at this wrong, maybe 30 ships added, 30 on top of everyone from Ur-Quan Masters. So not all those ships are going to make the cut. Some of them might turn into other things and whatever. But the idea is, if we need those different things, if we're building smart and we have the tools that let us build smart now, it becomes a lot easier to experiment and try. Like, we need that, yeah, as you said, categorically different. We need an experience that's categorically different. And so even just prototyping what those could be, like what would a new Sumatra be like, that's been a really fun thing to do. And I've learned it's pretty fast to do, especially when you have the conventions of Super Melee. The moment you twist one convention, and say, okay, Super Melee, but a giant stationary ship, that's what the Sumatra did. There was only one Sumatra. I mean, even just doing the Sumatra a few different ways, or like, okay, there's a big stationary thing. What's it like to interact with that is a pretty interesting question just on its own. And Ur-Quan Masters, when I think about, oh, what do I want for a sequel? It's what wasn't there time to do? How would I take stuff that like, I want to do more of this or whatever? And like the Sumatra for me actually is one of those, that was a cool battle. That was really fun because it just took what was there. And so the notion of, I'm going to twist Melee a little. Oh, wouldn't it be cool to do a few more things like this? And finding out what works, what doesn't. It's very much prototype driven, but it also has like, hey, welcome to, well, what are we now? 2024? I can't keep track. Welcome 2024, being able to try that stuff. If you have a like solid foundation of like, we have a running Super Melee, right? So we have running Melee. Gets a lot easier. So it's pretty exciting to know, like, if we need that very different thing, what should it be is a much easier question to answer.
yeah, I mean,
Yeah, I was going to give you a concrete example of some of the things we wrestle with, which is in 2024 and super graphics cards and super fast CPUs and 60 frames per second. It's difficult to imagine that turning in 1/16 of a circle is going to fly with the modern player. But that those quantized turning angles in Melee led to tactics that you could use against various other ships. And so with smooth turning at 60 frames per second, those tactics have to at least change if that's something we want to support. And so we definitely want this game to evoke memories of Ur-Quan Masters, but we want it to be updated enough so that hopefully we can get new fans of space opera into the fold. Yeah.
I mean, the turning angle thing is exactly right. I mean, it is interesting how I remember, inspired by both Melee and Super Melee, and then an arcade game called Two Tigers. I programmed in the computer lab a space fight game, dogfight spaceship game, in Quick Basic, and the low level Quick Basic functionality. The easiest way to read a key is using the in key command. the in key command doesn't detect if a key is pressed down, it detects if a key has been pressed. And so to turn, you would tap, 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 not hold down. If you held down and someone else tapped, it would screw, the keyboard input would break. And so the entire game, other than disrupting every class that had a sharing wall to our computer lab, because we had the old clacky PC keyboard. So the math class would hear clack, 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 shit, clack, 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 but the part of the strategy of the game was, can you turn fast enough? Can you recall how many times you have to hit to get to the angle you want? I changed it. There was a more elaborate way of using assembly within BASIC to read the memory register of what was being pressed down. That could detect 4 keys and 2 modifiers at once. So I switched the game, which was called Twin Cobras, I think that's what it was called, to use that function. And the entire game changed, because now you could hold down the button and shoot at the same time. You could hold down, shoot, and turn at the same time. And functionally, the logic of the game was identical. The only thing that had changed was how we were parsing keyboard commands, or rather parsing keyboard, but it's a totally different game. And it's interesting how these things develop. The other thing I think, in response to Dan, is the 2 other great, I mean, there are many great space opera games, but 2 of the ones that really made an impression on me are Free Space and its sequel, and Homeworld. And both of those games do what you were talking about, Dan, where it's like, I mean, literally, by the way, the 10 Sumatras, one of the great twists is you fought this ship for mission after mission, you finally blow it up, and you're like, I'm such a badass. And then you see silhouetted against the sun, it was just done with a skybox or something, 45 Siphonuses all converging on you. But both of them did this, what you were talking about, of now we're going to have a mission that's in a nebula. Now we're going to have a mission that's in a ship graveyard, where you're keeping the same control rules of how things move, but introducing some new element in. And that does seem like something that you would be able to do that you couldn't do when you were constrained by the memory and disk space of Ur-Quan Masters. That's now, you have infinite, the limiting resource is not how many varieties of ships we want to put in. It's when does too many ships dilute the distinctiveness of each one, and make it less fun rather than more fun, rather than how much can we fit on 3 floppy disks, or I can't remember how many floppy disks.
No, totally. I mean, it is like one of the, well, I love that there is an indie game scene, and Fred and I both worked at, I would say, some sort of AAA, AA, whatever. That was sort of a lot of our recent history. And, kind of coming back to this space, I could talk all about my game playing and my game tastes and all sorts of things. But one of the other challenges of kind of modern games is anything is possible. Therefore, why not do anything? and putting, like, I think I even said, like, working with constraints is the only way it can get anything done. So really the metaphor, this isn't mine, I forget where I got this. The metaphor I use a lot is, it's a little bit like being a newspaper editor. It's, you can fill your game with stories, but how is the player experiencing them? What words are in the title? What words are here right after? I forget what, I don't know actual newspaper terms. What's the little block of text before it says continued on page blah blah blah? It's about like choreography and pacing and layout. So the, like, we were talking earlier about the intro, and so yeah, we could have 10 Sumatras. Are you fighting them back to back? How do you pace that experience such that they have the impact? Or are you just, like you said perfectly, diluting? Can you dilute your own experience by doing too much? Because it's very easy to do it, even ignoring scheduling and just like, hey, you've overscoped the game. But the idea of intentionally limiting the player and saying, this is how you interact with the world. This is what you expect from the world. You can only pull a Pluto trick, like you were talking about, where expectations change if you actually put the ceiling down lower than where it needs to be. And so, like, very common game, game discourse, especially in AAA, and especially seeing like open world survival craft come up as a genre, which I thought was a joke name at some point that somebody came up, but it's like embraced it itself and owns it. It's like, it's the open world survival crafting game, but with insert word, is like, the dialogue around that, or even farming and life simulators, is so interesting to me because the things people want are very informed by the foundation of that game. And the foundation of games like that is not like this. It is like a horizon that extends forever and ever and ever. Like, oh, if I have farming, that means I want to have gardening. That means I want to have this. And it's just sort of like the box of anything that can fit in it. One of the things that for me, like, inspires me to create, and also is part of like a game like Ur-Quan Masters, I would say you could call it retro sensibilities or limitations that were enforced by technology, but it's piles and piles of content won't get us anywhere and will dilute, you know, some of the spirit of it. It's what's the pacing of it and what are the restrictions you put on it. And even like, you know, point and click adventure games, you know, it's just, I would, you know, just Primordia again comes to mind. It's super fresh on my mind, but it's just like, this is how you interact with the world. Don't, you can sit there and question it. If you step away from the game, you're like, how come I'm not doing, how come I can't do this? Or if you're not having fun, you might wish you could do something else. Like, oh, why can't I walk around with the keyboard or something like that? But the idea of saying, hey player, this is the world. This is your hand. This is how you touch it. I mean, that's the kind of thing that makes it a game and makes it interesting because you can't do anything. This is your, I mean, again, not to get high-minded about it or too high-minded about it, but it's like, it's self-actualization, you know, that's part of our jobs, or part of what I feel is my job as a designer is how does the player express themselves in the world? And that's what makes a game a role-playing game or whatever type of game it is. But, you know, in the Ur-Quan Masters, you self-actualize by being the captain. You fly a ship, you know, or you pilot the lander, or, you know, what's the mental fiction for like, am I piloting that ship that just got blown up? Probably not, because then I'd be dead, you know, in Super Melee or whatever. Like, but I must be inhabiting them somehow, right? And so letting the player, like, you don't have to answer that question. It's okay, but they know the rules, the sort of framework of what to expect. And that helps kind of keep the, I don't want to say pacing on track, but that's what also helps keep the like resonant message clear, is like going wide, that there's genres that can do that. This is I'm not saying the game is narrow-minded, you know, it can be open world. There's a ton of stars to explore, whatever, but the player's expectations for what to do have a pretty clear framework.
Yeah.
And my birds have a lot to say. I apologize. They're very excited about this conversation.
There's something amazing about these birds just flying in that they're very curious. I love the expression. Um, you know, I sort of play games less the older I've gotten, and so my sensibilities are very formed by older games. It's funny because one of the like shorthands I would use for many years was Zelda itemization. But of course, with the Zelda game that my daughters love, Breath of the Wild, Zelda itemization is no longer Zelda itemization at all. So the term is now I wonder whether the term is useful. But you know, with both adventure games and with Fallen Gods, one thing that I really wanted to get away from is like in a typical role-playing game, there are a bajillion items. Those items are incrementally different in a way that is nothing like fantasy, mythology, fiction, movies, anything else, right? Aragorn is not constantly switching out to a better sword, a better sword, a better sword, a better sword, a better sword. Indiana Jones is not going through 75 whips, or not even just whips, right? Sometimes it's a whip, sometimes it's a sword. He has a whip, sometimes a gun. There's a whole, and you know, this to me is like one of the weaknesses of role-playing games from a mimetic standpoint, from capturing that feel. Of course, it is fun in some respects. Certainly, some players love the min-max element and the variety. But at least to me, part of what was great about Super Melee, not just Super Melee, but also outfitting your ship in Ur-Quan Masters, was this sense that each thing was really different, right? You didn't just go up by one increased damage. There were some incrementalist stuff, but it was much more a sense of a limited number of chunky changes that were immediately discernible. The tagline we use on the Steam page for Fallen Gods is a game of game changers, that every item should materially change the player experience when you get it. So if you have Firebrand as your sword, that doesn't just increase your damage, it affects how you fight against trolls and troll shards. It allows you to do certain things to inspire soldiers in certain events, things like that, that should be woven throughout. But again, this is a retro sensibility. I'm curious how you guys strike the balance between the modern expectation to be able to customize and to have this variety with the roots of Ur-Quan Masters, which I think is more like what I would call Zelda itemization.
Dan, I'll let you answer that one. I mean, I think we can always fall back on, hey, we're doing a sequel to this game and we want it to be recognizable in some ways. But we do want to update it. So there's a continuum there, and I don't know how, Dan, you ride that continuum.
Yeah, I have the, I don't know, benefit, disease, whatever, of like, I'm not done playing games. I still like, I fired up Primordia last night and I'm like, that was fun. That was my night off. Normally I'm usually, I always say I don't have as much time for games as I used to when I was a kid, which is totally true. And that's part of why like my formative games are my formative games, because I didn't have anything else to do. It's like, okay, I'm home. I don't have to think about paying the bills and whatever. But the attitude I have is there's no wrong answers. And that sounds like a dodge. I can tell you a little bit about what we're doing for Children of Infinity to kind of sate the appetite and just give you ideas of, this feels like a dodge, but it's like, well, both work. It's about when you do them. So for example, like a good example, I think, even just from the Ur-Quan Masters is RU, right? RU is just a material, it's just a number. It's a make number go up. I mean, there's a whole genre of games, especially in mobile, which are just make number go up. Build factory, make factory go faster, make factory go harder. There's games like Factoria, which I love, right? And it is just about purely, that game is just a spreadsheet with an engine. And it's how it expresses itself to the player. So like what you're talking about your Stray Gods, it's all about the intent. What do you want the player to feel here right now? Because like you said, if you have this sword and it is supposed to be the imaginary sword, right? And you want the fiction of that to be so powerful for the player, don't make it a +1 version of it. That's you're actually undercutting what you're trying to do. So it's all about intent. So for me, like a good example of what we're doing in sort of Children of Infinity is I think of there's actually a lot in the game where I say all of these things that you think of as a ship or a planet or a star are characters, right? So as far as I'm concerned, the Ur-Quan Master is full of characters. There's a Spathi, there's Fwifo, there's also a Red Star, there's also a Treasure World, there's also the Yehat Terminator. All of these things for me are characters. And the reason that they're characters is they they have a semblance of who they are, and they're always going to be that. Is every treasure world going to be exactly the same way every Spathi is basically the same? No, but there's enough recognizable about it that I build a relationship with it and I can understand it. Stars, like unique stars, like bright, big stars. There aren't that many of them in Ur-Quan Masters, so they stand out, and that's okay. Whereas, are there lots of like red dwarfs? Sure, tons of them, because they're not that exciting. They're not that great. They don't need to stand out. So just as far as I guess my tastes and what works for the game pretty well, it is actually leaning more into like, you got the thing is special. You want that thing. Make a big chunky choice. So for example, one thing we're leaning into a little bit more with Children of Infinity is there's a contentious spot, which is I love that you can have, I jokingly call it the god ship. You know, at the end of Ur-Quan Masters, if you upgrade your flagship, you get the god ship and you win the game, right? Basically, you can defeat everything but the Sumatra. And then the Sumatra has the twist, which is good luck. You can't really fly that ship anymore. So the poor player who never got good at melee combat and has to go back to like, oh no, I don't really know how to fly. But don't worry, they gave you like Shimmer avatars and infinite resources. There's enough encouragement. But the idea is, I love the power fantasy and the curve of the god ship, right? Which is I get to have that fantasy. But what about those poor fleet ships? They have so much character. And so one of the things without being too specific about it, because we've played with a few different variants, but one of the things that I would love to lean into is think of it as like a JRPG. Who's in your party? That really matters. You might have 10 characters to pick from, or if you're like Chrono Cross, you could have, whatever, 40 characters to pick from, a crazy amount of characters to pick from. But who you decide to bring with you is a very meaty, chunky choice. You know, that is a big unit of choice that you get to make. And so leaning into like, hey, because I'm playing the way I want to play, I'm going to fill my roster with nothing. I mean, there's joke versions of this. I have nothing but Shofixti scouts. I'm going to somehow win the game with a roster of Shofixti scouts. So leaning into the things that have that like meaty, chunky character is one dimension. And I think that has a lot of value. But there's also, you know, an upgrade tree. How much of it is a tree and how much of it is just a ladder where there's nowhere to go but up, you know? Do we want to give you like new ship modules like in Ur-Quan Masters, like the Shiva furnace and things like that? There's spectrums there, but maintaining, you know, I would say the emphasis and kind of grounding is on what's a big meaty choice I made, because again, the game for me, the stat game is all about min-maxing. The chunky choice is about self-actualization and about agency, and I am the captain. So for me, being the captain, I mean, someone could say like, I'm playing a 4X game and by upgrading my fleet defense, I feel like the captain. You could, that's fine. That's, that is a reasonable thing to say. But for the Ur-Quan Masters, part of being the captain is you're not the admiral sitting there with a spreadsheet. You're not punching numbers into a calculator. You are Captain James T. Kirk or whoever your fantasy captain is. You're on the bridge and you say, I want this stuff. I don't care how it gets done. Make it happen. And you get to feel that sense of power and agency. And power is maybe the wrong word, but agency and like authority. It's not the bureaucratic authority of numbers and stats and upgrades. It's the, I've made a choice. These are my captain. This is my fleet. I'm in charge here, let's go, you know, and not make it a big ladder to climb up, but make it a little speed bump. So that's the kind of player fantasy fiction that I like. I would love someone to experience. Can there be upgrades? Can there be numerical increases? Yeah, Ur-Quan Masters had it. Thrusters, turners, you know, for your flagship. It's more about like, we can kind of have both, but a big part is knowing what you're trying to get out of each one. You know, if you do the D&D thing and have numbers, then you're playing the min-max game. But the only reason it works too is if you just had that, but you didn't get to say, ooh, I'm a half elf and I grew up as a poor child on the streets or whatever, then it wouldn't work. The point is you have to have that role-playing fantasy of here's who I am. I need a way to express that in a chunky choice, like choice-driven way. That was very wordy, but I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, there's an opportunity out there for the I guess we call them fleet ships in the adventure game, which really in Ur-Quan Masters only expressed themselves in melee, the ships themselves. And there's an opportunity for them to have and add to their character in the adventure game, as opposed to just fighting in battles.
Yeah, just speaking as a developer, it makes me feel sad that I put all this work into like making the Shofixti Scout cool, making the Pakunk Fury cool, making all these ships really neat, and then a player is just going to make the flagship upgraded and never play with my toys. You know, that just sort of that breaks my heart a little. I'm teasing a bit, but you know, truly, let's optimize for the work we want to do, and those ships have a lot of character. So if there's a way to make it more accessible, like I'll be honest, I think Super Melee is hard for a lot of players, you know, especially a modern player where those controls are somewhat unusual. I think like any game that has somewhat unusual controls, if you gel with it and get into it, then it's fun, but you have to get over the initial, like there's going to be a learning curve there because not a lot of games really control that way anymore.
And
So
sadly, no more bruises because you'll be playing over the internet.
we're still working on new technology that will allow you to hurt people in new
That's
ways.
haptic feedback right here.
That's right.
Well, but even that's another good example of like modern players. Like, how many 1v1 fighting games are out there? How popular is that as a genre now that people aren't playing in arcades or sitting at the same computer or sitting at the same game console? I'm not saying those games shouldn't exist. It's just that's clearly a genre on decline, you know? And so Super Melee as a 1v1 space combat thing is a thing to have because it's cool for a certain population, but thinking about, hey, I'd really like if people could play together. You know, co-op games are much bigger. And like, wouldn't it be great if you and I could get into a battle with an Ur-Quan dreadnought, right? Or whatever, you know, that's cool. And then we can play together and it's us against the world. That's the kind of spirit of, I don't want to just say modern gamers because it's also my spirit too, which is I'll play almost anything if I can play it with someone I like.
So shifting gears to totally different question. Uh, there was Ur-Quan Masters is 30 years old or however many years old it is. In the interim, you have all kinds of fan creations and some better than others. I will say there's one particular artist, Niklas Jansson. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. Arna is the
We're working with him. Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, that's fabulous. So I was going to say, back in, I don't know, 2000 or something, I came across his website where he had sketched out his thoughts for a sequel, which had this, I thought, absolutely brilliant. These arcs appear, one for each race, from an unknown source. And it had this one detail that I remember. I can't remember everything about it, but which was that the Druge had torn their arc apart to sell off the component pieces. And so they don't make it. Everyone else gets on their arc and escapes, and the Druge are stuck in the flood or whatever wipes them out. So this is part of the answer, it sounds like, is you bring in the creator. But what I was going to pose is, like, how do you see a good idea that a fan came up with? Do you feel like you can't use it because it was already sort of trod by someone else? Do you feel like that's great and we should be mining all the fan ideas that are out there, obviously in a way consistent with intellectual property law? I'm not suggesting anything improper, but like I suspect there are writers. This is one reason I think probably George R.R. Martin can't write another book, right? Is that he basically was driven into paralysis by fan theories and then by a television show that's already told the story he was going to tell. Do you feel any of that anxiety and paralysis when there are all these fan works out there? Is it an opportunity? How do you approach it?
Well, I mean, I would say that we don't actively mine ideas, but clearly when we did Ur-Quan Masters, we were influenced by authors, and Starflight, and early video
Space
games
War,
that
stuff like that.
we're doing pieces of what we thought were interesting. I guess we don't have an overall strategy other than we're not out there looking for people to tell us what to do. Although what we end up doing, I guess what I'm getting at is what we end up doing is there's probably nothing new under the sun. And it's really how you rearrange and combine ingredients, whether you know that you're using someone else's original idea at some point, that it was original, and you may not even know it was an idea to get inspiration from.
Well, I'm very glad to hear that Arna, I don't know what she goes by when he works here, is on. But I think I interacted with him once on Twitter 10 years ago. But his art always struck me as threading the needle we talked about before, which is it is high resolution renderings of the characters and ships and stuff, that feels true to the vision of the original game. but also more detailed, more varied, and things like that, which, you know, but for having seen his art, I would just say it's not really possible to achieve that effect. But obviously it is possible. I have seen it. And I actually, Dan, I don't know if it was one of your dev logs or Fred, one of yours, there was like showing how you did, might have been the Chimera avatar. I think that was the ship. And like how you use modern technology to basically end up with something that looks, it fits like the comfortable old shoe that we've been wearing for 30 years, but no longer has holes in the sole, no longer is scuffed everywhere, but it still has that fit and that feel, which I thought that was really cool. It was interesting, and obviously the third game in the series I think failed completely in that regard. It, you know, did do a stylistic upgrade for the time. And I don't know anyone who loves the second. I'm sure there's someone out there who loves everything. Every ugly child has a loving mother. But
Yeah.
there's I don't know any of the fans who are like, oh, that's how I always thought the Siren actually looked. It was just that it was a, you know, VGA simplification. Everyone was like, oh good Lord. This is like a nightmare of anyway, but I thought the way you guys did that ship, at least, it felt completely authentic. Maybe that's the word for it. It felt authentic to the memory while still being modern and various lighting and turning and things like that.
Yeah, we're trying.
That's Fred, you know, you may notice the deltas and how many words we each use, but yeah, in this case, I could say what Fred just said in a lot more words, but you know, just to like it's everything, like especially in game development, everything's easier said than done, you know, and you know full well too, you know, it's like, wow, that sure sounds easy when I say it like that, but you know how much work it is to do that, and you know how much maybe experience was behind those choices and whatever, you know, or maybe you don't, and we're all still learning. But being on the path of learning is kind of the only way I can motivate myself, you know, and say, well, I have to try, I have to see what I know and see what I don't know, and then, you know, my experience is the sum total of my failures. The nice thing you bring up, the counterpoint, I have never played the third game, so I am completely ignorant to everything about it, and that's not intentional. It's just something I've never done. But at this point, working on the game, I'm like, I don't really need any more input. You know, to Fred's point, we're not really scouring for ideas. You know, there's a lot of ideas out there, and I could argue things that weren't even sequels to Ur-Quan Masters sure show a lot of inspiration from it, right? And you can see the, you know, oh, people, there's sort of influences, and you know, that's how we all get inspired as creators. We see what other things were made, and we go, oh, I love that. I want to, what does that mean to me? And so you know, using that chip art as an example, it is kind of a little bit of what I was saying, which is the spirit of ships being characters. And, you know, I maybe I have a knack for making comparisons that make no sense to anybody, because you have to have the perspective, and I'm very bad at framing that. So some self-awareness here. I say it's like Skylanders. I mean, I worked on Skylanders, and when we're working on Skylanders, I know Paul's not here, but Fred, maybe you can back this up too. It would be like, you know, there's a joke that we just keep making the same game. But, you know, Skylanders was from an old design doc in 2005, you know, for a game that never got made. But the design doc is there and the roots are there. And if you read that design doc, it's full of the Ur-Quan Masters stuff. It has nothing to do with space per se. It's a very fantasy game. But the idea is every ship is a toy, and every ship is a gift and a present. And when I get it, it's more like a character, you know, and if you're familiar with Skylanders, there were tons and tons of box figurines, but there's this emotional ramp you're on, and it's, ooh, I see the thing. I might want that thing, but I don't really know what it feels like until I get it in my hands. And then when it's in my hands, then it feels good and exciting. And I know it's different from all the other toys. It's a toy like everything else, but it's different from the toys I've played with before. So it can exist as a ship. Sorry, the birds are really excited about ships right now. It can exist as a ship, but you know, the spirit of that Tremor and doing that is really the harder part, in my opinion, is to not go crazy with, well, technology lets you do everything, so why not just do everything? It's, let's be intentional and say, what's the main goal? The player is the captain, agency first. What do I want out of this laser? I want it, this is the Avatar. It's one of the best ships in the game. It has an awesome feel. It has an awesome sound. It is full of power, energy, and agency. It is not a funny ship. There is no comedy to it, right? For example, there's plenty of ships in Ur-Quan Masters that do have comedy and embrace that. You know, the Shofixi Scout, great example. It's like, if you use the glory device, you know, the sound it makes is like absurd and ridiculous, and it makes you laugh. So for me, the spirit overall of doing it is understand the character of the ship. Like, who is this ship? What would it be like to talk to the ship? And this sounds super like spiritual, but I don't really mean it that way. And what it would be like to talk to the ship. What does this ship have to say to me? What do I get to communicate with it? And it's like, I have the best laser in the world. Okay, what does that feel like? And if you look at the original, it's like some sparkly dots, a flickering line, you know, I mean, it's a product of the time and technology. So I go, okay, well, what do I need to do that? And how do I stray from that? And it's a little exploration. It's a little bit of art, a little bit of experience, you know, and the idea is, hey, this is one toy, but there's a lot of toys for a player to play with. And I just want to make sure that the player feels that each time. And, you know, again, I'm more a designer. Yeah, I'm a VFX artist too, but I'm much more a designer. And it's the approach of that emotion. And just circling back to kind of what Finn was saying, like, it is hard. It is hard.
Well, you know, when you talk about the Ur-Quan Masters impact and sometimes how it's not obvious. So Fallen Gods, which is a fantasy role-playing game with nary a science fiction element in sight, owes a direct lineage to Ur-Quan Masters. So rewinding back to 2005, ever since playing these games as a kid, I'd want to make a space opera game. I had tried various times. I had never succeeded. In 2005, I played a game called Strange Adventures in Infinite Space, which had a sequel called Weird Worlds. They were explicitly inspired by Ur-Quan Masters. I think it's acknowledged in the
Like in the credits, yeah.
It's a fabulous pair of games. Very, very original. A roguelite before the word roguelite was used for anything. There's no overarching narrative to it. It's very simple. The art is very compelling, particularly in Weird Worlds. And I played it and thought, this is it. What if you could marry this with text adventure vignettes that would tell the story? Like in the game books I played as a kid, like Lone Wolf in particular was an example of that. So set out to make this game called Star Captain, which was going to be my effort to finally scratch the space opera niche. I read whatever it was, 100 space opera novels, watched space opera movies, TV shows, read the books, whatever. Working on it, you know, vast design document. At the time, I was working as a contractor for S2 Games, makers of Heroes of New Earth. They were going to partner with me to develop it. But then, you know, I was a lawyer at the same time, and it just didn't pan out, and made Primordia instead. After Primordia was going to turn back to Star Captain. But in the intervening years, Mass Effect had come out, Faster Than Light had come out. It turned Faster Than Light basically did the very thing that I was thinking of fantastically well. And so I was like, I think I'm too late. And
It's never too late.
while I was thinking of it, I came across this old board game, Barbarian Prince. Barbarian Prince was made by Arnold Hendricks, who also made one of my favorite PC role-playing games, Darklands. And I realized, holy shit, this guy in like 1982, without a computer, had come up with this same narrative randomization with little vignettes concept on a board game. That's actually the model. I'll try that. it's now been a decade that we've been developing it. Every Norse game in the world has come out, and this exact model's come out. So it turns out there's no escaping. It's like everyone thinks when my older daughter's named Eleanor. We thought it's a family name. No one's named Eleanor. 3 Eleanors on her soccer team. That everyone is drinking from the same well. But ultimately, the first thing that started the avalanche here was wanting to finally make the space opera that I've dreamed of making since playing Ur-Quan Masters. So, we don't have any spaceships in the game, but I really do feel like that was what got the project kicked off. And I'm confident you would find that kind of genealogy to so many games because, when you create a game that has soul to it, it's not just that it makes you want to make a space opera or it makes you want to make a shooter game or whatever. It's that you want to make a game that you can share with the world that enriches players the way that game enriched you. And I for one, there were 10, I don't know, maybe 10 games that had that impact on me when I was young. Dan, you say it's because you had more time to play games. That's true, but it's also just when we're young, things hit us differently. Our brain plasticity decreases as we get older. This is why everyone thinks the best music was the music that was out when they were 13. Like it's, or the true love of their life was the girl they met when they were 16 or whatever. Like it's, part of it is just organic. But, those games I played from like 1988 to 1994, XCOM is another one.
Yeah.
Final Fantasy II is another one. Dark Sun, Shattered Lands, Fallout, Loom, Planescape Torment. There's just a small number of them where you're like, my whole life, any game I make will be either an effort to imitate or a reaction or an homage or trying to pay it forward. And again, for me, and I'm sure for thousands of developers, Ur-Quan Masters is one of them. And my hope is, with the new game you guys are making, there'll be another generation that's similarly inspired to make these kinds of games that aren't just how much more can we put in, but as Dan says, what can I give the player experientially? What characters can I give them? What toys I can give them? Those are the things we remember, not, like I remember the Daggerfall, maybe it was the box for Arena, or maybe it was Daggerfall, was like listed the number of square miles that the world was. That means nothing to me. The thing that Daggerfall that sticks with me is that first cinematic, excuse the gloom, the nature of my troubles is darker still. And like, that feeling it gave me. And to the extent the mileage affected me, it was the scale that affected me. And those are the gifts, anyway, I'm glad to hear that that's the philosophy you guys are bringing to it, because it seems like the right one.
Yeah, and the dirty secret is when we were making Ur-Quan Masters, we had no notion of what its future impact might be. We we were making something out of love that we wanted to make, and we had no notions of grandeur beyond that.
That's probably why. I mean, I think if you had gone in with a sense of cult destiny, it probably there would have been paralysis or pretense or something would have interfered with it. But whether it was your intention or not, that is the effect.
Good job. Let's fail intentionally again. Wait, no, succeed unintentionally. Wait, what are we doing? I mean, I also think like it's interesting thinking about or as you were bringing up sort of influences from our childhood. I think one of my genetic traits, I say not necessarily because I inherited it from anybody biologically, but one of my at least traits I carry around and identify with me is, I'll just call it punk rock, which is I'm motivated to rail against reality whatever I can. So exactly what you brought up about like Well, your brain capacity changes, the gray matter and whatever, the composition of your brain changes. Like, it's not like, oh, I don't want to grow old, I'm going to fight that, but more to the point of like, hey, one, this is not prescriptive. This is me, this is know thyself. But for me, living in the past doesn't really get me anywhere except to acknowledge what it did at that time. And one of the things one of the reasons I play games is because I still love them, and I took a break from game development very intentionally. And actually, it was supposed to be a permanent break. I was like, I'm done. I don't need to do this anymore. It's okay. I can just go back to enjoying games. So I'll spare you the lengthy story of why I wound up here. And it doesn't mean, well, I don't want to make games. Obviously, I want to do what I'm doing right here. But the attitude of like, I have a favorite game and I can, name it and talk about it. But as a fan, as a creator, I don't want to make that game. Someone else did it. I'm inspired by it. I see what it does in its composite parts. And one of the most, so spoiler, it's Earthbound. One thing that I didn't understand as a child is Earthbound is also a cult classic. I didn't know it because I would talk to people about Earthbound, like, you mean that game with the weird box and like funny looking aliens? What's going on here? Me saying Earthbound is like the best game in the world right now sort of feels like it's a joke. It's like saying, oh my gosh, Star Wars is the coolest thing ever. You got to hear about Star Wars, where it's like, there's like, if you go like, Undertale came out. And so what I've seen as a sort of creative working in this industry is I never had time to do my own Earthbound, inspired thing. But also I probably wouldn't have done that because that's not necessarily what motivates me. That's a memory that I carry with me. And I think about, oh, how can I do that? And if I were to cite influences on this project, you might even, it might even confuse some people. But what I've seen is like those games inspire different people and everybody gets, and like you said, we drink from the same well. So seeing games like Undertale come out, seeing games like Lisa come out, which in Lisa, if you go to that author's webpage, they just straight up say, I love Earthbound. It is the best game in the world. It looks like an old GeoCities page. No knocks on it. Lisa's a great game. And they just pretty much set out with intent to say, I want to make a game like Earthbound and I'm going to do it. There's games like Everhood, which you could argue are just trying to be like Undertale. There's all kinds of this like cyclical nature of creativity. But back to the punk rock part, one of the reasons I play modern games is because I like seeing other people's journey that you're talking about, which is I loved something and I want to try to create it with love too. And what does that look like? You might not even be able to connect the dots. I've thrown this around for a few people and, I say it because it means something to me and, maybe it'll mean something to someone else someday. But Spiritfarer is a game that came out, I don't even know how long ago, 5 years ago, something like that. But maybe less than that. Anyway, Spiritfarer, indie game made by, I think, Canadian developer. That's the most Ur-Quan Masters game that I've ever played since Ur-Quan Masters, that I like to say. And if you're like, what? It's because this, I will, the high level breakdown is if you haven't played Spiritfarer, you're
I played it with my daughter, so
okay, great. Yeah. But it's a game about sailing around a map, meeting friends, trying to accomplish tasks, some of which are very grindy, and effectively having a pseudo open world where you spend a lot of time interacting with the interface, but it's all in purpose of giving you're the captain of the ship. You're Sharon. I don't know how to pronounce the name. You're that person now, that mythological creature. And you're in charge and it's up to you to decide what we want to do. And then you meet other characters, and they ask you for things and you have to think about how you want to do it. So that was just a very kind of, I don't know if they played Ur-Quan Masters. I don't know if they thought that, but the interesting thing is even me, just my guess is they were not trying to make Ur-Quan Masters, right? The odds are. But in playing that game and I said, wow, this is like Ur-Quan Masters. That's a whole new kind of creation and creativity that just happened by me observing someone else's thing. So to, end this sort of ramble on like, hey, how are we, what does it mean to like go back to your childhood? Part of how I guess rail against that is to stay fresh and to like, I mean, you have a child, right? So it's like one of the things I love that I don't get to do enough. I don't have kids, but being around kids is really important to me because kids can carry that. And one of the things I loved the most about working on Skylanders was, and frankly, almost all the games I made were kids games, is watching a kid play your game immediately brings you back to that mindset. Even if you yourself can't have that, seeing the things that affect them, seeing the way their magical thinking informs what's going on. They're not asking like, well, what's the specs on this game and how many polys was that thing? They don't even know what that is, you know, and they're not even close to knowing what that is. So being able to like watch other people's creation, whether they're players, whether they're actual developers, reinterpreting and rehashing is like a constant way of me saying it's not on me to like find influences, quote unquote. It's I can get it by proxy. So then to just like tie off this little talk, you know, one of the things that inspires me creatively, and I think I use when I think about Children of Infinity, and I think about, you know, I've heard Fred talk at length, you know, Paul too, frankly, talk about, you know, what it was like working on the Ur-Quan Masters and all these different stories, and have got just, they all live in my head now. And one of the things that really resonates with me personally is I like art that makes me want to go do that art. You know, it doesn't mean like, look, I went to a museum over the weekend and yeah, I used to paint and I used to draw and I love like Renaissance art, you know, because there was a time where I'm like, I want to go to Florence and study to become a Renaissance painter. I don't want this new painting. I want to be a Renaissance painter. That's my favorite thing in the world. And that kernel is there. Obviously, I'm not doing that with my life, but the idea that hey, what I could make someone else want to make something and vice versa. That's what inspires me. Like when I play a game and I think, gosh, what would it be like to make this? That would be so cool. Or what choices would I make is super engaging to me. And so I guess the spirit of creativity and trying to remain young and fresh, even if our influences are old or new or whatever, it's just as you're saying, like, hey, I played the Ur-Quan Masters, it, you know, it sounds like it meant something to you and you wanted to go, you even tried to make some games around it. Now you're finally getting to work on the project that you feel is true to that. It is that, like, it's very cyclical. It comes around and that's very motivating to me too, even if years pass, right? I just killed the conversation with a long ramble. I can do this all day. It's because I live alone with 4 parrots. They listen to me all day. Sorry.
I didn't want to step on Fred's toes if you wanted to chime in. I mean, a lot of what you said, you know, resonated with me, including seeing kids play games. I have 2 daughters, they're 11 and 13 now. Both of them grew up playing adventure games because I made Primordia with my younger daughter on my lap, or my older daughter on my lap. We would act out scenes. We'd basically mock out scenes. I would, you know, be Crispin and she'd be Horatio, or, you know, things like that. And that's, you know, that's part of how the game development process worked. And then we would play adventure games together, and differences that are invisible to an adult come into very stark relief. This is neither here nor there for Children of Infinity or Fallen Gods, but an example of this is my daughters loved Monkey Island 1, loved Monkey Island 2, hated Monkey Island 3. Now, if you said, okay, they hated it because it looked like a Saturday morning cartoon, I'd say that would make sense. Not at all. The definitive difference was in puzzle design. Again, if you would ask me, was there a big watershed in puzzle design between Monkey Island 1 and 2 and Monkey Island 3? As an adult or even as a teenager when I played them, I would have said no. But it turns out the watershed is that the earlier games, the puzzles are highly tactile and driven by the items which are obvious from the item icon. There is almost never a puzzle where what you need to understand the puzzle is to listen to the dialogue. They were largely bored with the dialogue in all of the games. Monkey Island 3, the puzzles make absolutely no sense unless you listen to the dialogue. Now, of course, as a teenager and adult, the dialogue's hilarious. I love the dialogue. Of course, I listen to it. If you're like them and skip through it, the entire thing might as well just be pick a number out of a hat until you pick the right number. And so they hated the game. That was like a really revelatory thing. Another example is Pajama Sam, an adventure game that I was too old for when it came out, that I played with them, has randomization in it. I would have told you this is the stupidest feature to put into an adventure game. No one ever plays an adventure game more than twice, if you're lucky. once is probably enough for most people. But children consume games like they consume TV shows, which is they love to watch them over and over and over. And the joy of things being a little different every time is palpable. And it was just revelatory. That actually is something that is applied to Fallen Gods, which is a procedurally generated game. And yeah, I just think the other thing is the sense of fun, as you were talking about earlier. Kids really come to games, they come to them for mastery, because kids do care a lot about mastery, but they also care a lot about fun. They don't care so much about the like min-max Skinner box stuff. They can be trained that way. I mean, that's the nature of how a lot of sort of abusive game design works, is it hooks kids with Skinner box mechanics, but their intuition is they love to just click on things and see what happens. They love to just explore and play with the toys that you give them. And that's really refreshing to see. Like to them, a new item is not just about which has the highest DPS to kill an enemy. It's like, it's so much fun to like blow the enemy around with a fan and see all of that. And so like the way they would play Kirby, for instance, totally different from how I play Kirby. I would always, this character has the most mobility, and so I'd always pick this character. But for them, it's like, it's hilarious to play as the Rock, and so they would play as that. So anyway, it's helpful to have them. They're outgrowing games to some extent. My younger daughter still works on Fallen Gods with me. The older one mostly doesn't, but it's, they're a great asset as a developer.
Yeah, for sure. They have different perspectives, and we learned that quite a bit through Skylanders.
Yeah, and even before that, my earliest memory of a playtest is watching a child fail horribly at a level I designed, and me going, "Oh no, this poor kid! Oh gosh, what are they doing? Oh no!" And then I talked to them afterward. It was like 7-year-old, 6-year-old, and I said, "What do you think? What was that like?" And he said, "I had so much fun." And I was like, "Wait, but you couldn't even beat the level." He's like, "I was supposed to beat a level? I just thought I was having fun." So yeah, allow yourself, I guess, whether you actually introduce real children into the room or just, I mean, do play test, yes, obviously, but like, there are different players of different ages, different people are going to come into things. And that's one of the fun, for me, one of the fun parts about games is they're not just a linear medium that everybody can have like an experience with. It's people are going to latch on to different things and have their favorite parts, and that's for me also a spirit of, the Ur-Quan Masters, which is, well, I connect with that. And, I know we've been talking about Ur-Quan Masters a lot, but like one of the things I loved in Primordia actually is that, I don't know how to describe this. I was talking to someone about The Incredible Machine a couple weeks ago, a game which I loved as a kid. And one of the things I was really enjoying in Primordia is even when I'm failing, I'm having fun. That sense, and that was purely because of the banter dialogue, right? And the idea that my failure would result in an amusing line of dialogue and an amusing interaction, and even me like trying to use like, "Hey robot, go do that," and my robot would give me like snark and talk back to me. That kind of thing is like, you know what? That is, I really loved that. Just by the way, just wanted to make sure to tell you that. Like, I love that. And I found that even if there were parts where I'm like scratching my head and feeling dumb, because I like puzzle and detective games too. I'm just like, I'm so stupid, I can't figure this out. Or puzzle games, adventure games, anything that makes me feel like I'm not dumb for being dumb or being stupid actually is its own reward was really compelling. And I liked how that did that. So this sort of, that's an honest question. Like, was that intentional? Did you learn that, how to do it? Was that like, where was some of that coming from? And like, what's your relationship with, even when I'm losing, I'm winning, I guess.
Super intentional. And so first, writing the story to Primordia was easy. I think I had it fully laid out in like 3 days. The dialogue for the story beats took longer, and we went through a lot of revision. the most time consuming thing is writing all the quips is what we would call them, which is, when you use an item on another item. But to me, that is like, what is so great about a game is like the player agency, right? And so the best way to reveal a character is through the gameplay. And these interactions, to me, were an opportunity for that. And and the minimum that we could give. It's not a simulation, so most interactions don't go anywhere. So there has to be something. And in a typical adventure game, the response is just like, I can't do that. And I always hated that. So it seemed to me one of two things that you would want to do. One is, wherever possible, even if it's just a joke, the joke should be like pointing you towards the actual solution. Because it's much better if that's how you get to the solution than by seeking out a direct hint. But the other is, at a minimum, you want the player to feel like you and the player are laughing together at the inherent absurdity of adventure game puzzle solving, rather than the game is laughing at the player because he can't guess what you're thinking. And I think Sierra adventure games have gotten a little bit of a bad rap for their difficulty level. But it is true, there was, a lot of the older adventure games, you got the sense that like the designer was enjoying putting one over on you and wasting your time and being sort of mean-spirited, setting you back, punishing you and things like that, where even at the time I didn't enjoy it, but now, like, I'm a grown man. No, that's how you want to play? I'll just uninstall the game. Who's winning now? And I'll refund on top of that. So, dealing with that from a player experiential standpoint was important. I will say, because I do think Sierra has gotten a bad rap, here is my defense of Sierra. King's Quest is a fairy tale. It is not a fantasy story, it is a fairy tale story. Fairy tales are full of arbitrary rules with catastrophic consequences. If you stray from the path, your grandmother is eaten by a wolf. Like, the two things bear no correspondence at all. If you are supposed to say something 3 times and you say it 4 times, you're decapitated. This is like the entire game of fairy tales is those rigid, legalistic rules. If you don't say the genie wish just right, you get turned into a frog. Whatever. And I think it is quite captures that experience. Now, from a modern player expectation standpoint, it's really frustrating. But as a kid, it was also frustrating, but I recall that it was immersive as well. Now, some of the decisions, like having the Batmobile come out of the witch's cave in King's Quest 2, I can't defend that. Like, when you break the mimesis, you can't defend it. But particularly like King's Quest 3, I think is a very fairy tale story. And things like a path that is so perilous that if you take one wrong step, you die, as the route that you have to take in order to leave the home in which you're bound as a slave. That particular element doesn't appear in a fairy tale, but if the Grimm brothers had uncovered that in a fairy tale, none of us would say that's not how fairy tales work. We would have said, oh yeah, obviously this is teaching some important life lesson about don't stray from the path of righteousness. The devil's snares are everywhere. The road to hell is, any step off the road to heaven is you're now on the road to hell. Whatever. And so I don't know. I think that's quite great. Police Quest, people complain like, oh yeah, like you could kill yourself by forgetting to holster your gun or whatever it was, or leaving. You could be fired by not leaving without checking out the gun. Having been a prosecutor for a part of my career, I mean, this is mimetic as well. Part of being a police officer is like endless paperwork, and if you get it wrong, someone can get shot, or you can get fired, or the chain of evidence is broken, the chain of custody is broken. And so whether it was a good idea or a bad idea to design games this way, that was intentional as something other than just cheesing on the player. I think there was an honest intent. But myself, as a modern designer, am more drawn to the LucasArts convention, which is essentially a compact with the player that I'm inviting you to explore, to laugh at jokes, and to participate in the jokes. It stops being funny if the punchline of the joke is you just lost an hour and a half of your life because when you ate the apple an hour and a half ago, you used an item that is critically necessary to tempt fawn in this sequence, which Kyrandia had that. Now Kyrandia had 2 apples, so maybe it's shame on me for senselessly eating 2 apples when there's no hunger meter in the game. But I remember that happening when I first played Kyrandia and being absolutely furious because I was always just saving over the same save and had to replay quite a lot. So anyway, long answer, Dan, which is yes, what I want in our adventure games is for the player to be focused on the sense of adventure, the sense of accomplishment, and the sense of challenge, but not to be feeling like it's an antagonistic relationship between the game and the player.
I mean, the Sierra games directly influenced Ur-Quan Masters in that exact way, where we said, let's not do that. Let's make it a challenge, but let's have the player always be able to recover from his choices.
And there are multiple solutions. I mean, that's one of the great things in Ur-Quan Masters is like you can completely screw up something and still win the game some other way. There are a few, I seem to recall there are a few ways you could turn yourself into a Walking Dead. But if you hadn't had that, I don't know. Well, I guess I'll ask you this, Fred. One of the things that I love about that game and also love about Fallout is the time limit. Both games, the time limit in reality is illusory. I refuse to believe any player has actually, I mean, of course, as every child has a mother who loves them, there's someone who's run out of time, no matter what the time limit is for every game. But to me, there was never any actual time limit, but there was a perception of creeping doom in both of those games. And things you could do, you could send, like I recall, you could cause the Thredash to go fight in a feudal. The Ilrath you could send to go fight by mimicking their gods, and all those things only landed because there was a time limit. If you had instead made it that each one of those like chipped off 10% of the boss's MHP, so that the final battle is easier, I actually think it would backfire because then the final fight would be not as challenging, not as satisfying. But when it's, you're staving off the end of the game, it feels better. Every modern gamer I've ever talked to says they despise the time limits in both those games because it takes away the sense of fun. So what are you guys doing? I assume there's not a time limit, but what do you do to give that same sense? I guess 2-part. When making it the first time, particularly with what you said about Sierra, how did you feel about the player experience, the time limit? And then what are you doing in Children of Infinity to get that same effect without a time limit or with a time limit?
Well, we didn't debate much about whether or not to have a time limit. Everything's smoke and mirrors, and especially back then when you did have such limited resources, it was a lot of smoke and mirrors. And so the longer you let somebody mess around in the smoke and mirrors, the less of an experience it becomes. It lessens they don't ever want to look at it again. So yeah, there are the players that want to I want to visit every single planet and I want to do this, and we definitely didn't serve those players. But and you're right, having a time limit, at least in today's sensibilities, it just doesn't really fly very well anyway. So yeah, you could lose the game. And that's kind of what made it the game we were making, that there were high stakes in the universe, and you couldn't just mess around forever. Um, but as you alluded to, you could always win the game if you knew what you were doing enough. Because if you needed an item from an alien and the Korra had already started their death march and extinguished that alien, you could always go to their home planet and it would just be lying there on their home planet and you could pick it up. So you could always win up until the point where the Korra destroyed Earth, kind of, or, yeah. And we didn't really have much of a conversation about whether or not to have a time limit. And you do get hints that you can't just mess around forever.
What happens, by the way, having never even gotten remotely close, when they destroy Earth, do you have a game over screen, or is it just that because the player is getting squeezed out of being able to refuel eventually?
No, it's game over if they destroy Earth, but Earth is the last thing they destroy. They go around and destroy every other alien race first. So
Is there like a splash screen? I'm just curious.
I think there's a conversation, right?
there might be, I don't even remember. There might be a conversation, but it could be. I mean, the other way you could lose the game was if you got the Utwig bomb and you exercised it in the menu as one of your items, and it would just like fade to black.
I recall that.
Yes. Who amongst us didn't do that?
So, but I think that was really the only two ways to lose was blow yourself up. I mean, to have to restart the game, blow yourself up, or just run out of time completely.
Yeah, for like watching modern players who've never played the game before is always interesting data. And anecdotes are only as useful as, well, as anecdotes. So the challenge I see with the time limit in Ur-Quan Masters for modern players, regardless of taste, I totally like you're asking the hard questions here, because that's one of those ones where the theatrics and the effect are undeniably powerful. What I see with modern players is they get stuck not knowing what they don't know. So in one case is some players don't even learn about the time limit. They just don't figure it out. And it's too late. And then something happened and there's no explanation of what happened and what they did wrong. The real challenge for players that I see a lot is, lots of people save scum when they're playing Ur-Quan Masters. Is they don't know what Fred just said. They don't know, even if you're during the death march, there is a way you can win the game. And so players think they've gummed up their save and it's over and they have to go way further back than they do. The kind of additional appendix to that is that you hope the player knows where the home world is to even go pick up the item. You hope the player, there's a lot of layers of knowledge, and I've watched different players encounter the death march at different places of knowledge, because there are players just straight up, I've watched someone play, they didn't know the game had a time limit, they didn't know extinguishing was coming, and they loved visiting every planet. And they loved picking up every single mineral, and they thought that was fun, and that's what they wanted to do. They ignored the story. They ignored everything. And I was like, again, to like you were talking about watching kids play the game, like that's not how I would play. I would get tired of this real fast, but someone was enjoying that, and that's one of the cool parts about the Ur-Quan Masters is there's a lot for people to enjoy in there. And so when they got a game over, they were like, what? What just happened? They didn't encounter any. I mean, yeah, the probes come at you or whatever. So, that's one of those things where, like, of course, in hindsight, you can say, but when you learn in play tests, you can't stand there telling the player what to do and giving them information. It's them in the game. So to answer, or to, I guess, not answer a little bit of what we're doing with Children of Infinity is, if there are games that leverage time, the Persona series is a great example. Stardew Valley, they build a calendar, like a literal calendar, into the game. And it's a core conceit of the game that there is a calendar, that time marches forward. Stardew Valley, not so much. The consequences are much lower. But games like Persona are like, hey, at this date, like especially go back to Persona 3, at this date, the boss will show up. You better be ready. You got 30 days to get ready. But it makes it a little more piecemeal, right? So it's not like, oh, the end is coming, but you still get the sense that stuff is out of control and you're weak and they're strong because you can't stop time. So the true and honest answer is it's fairly unsettled. You know, that is true and honest. One of the complicating factors, and I'm not going to say this is, you know, this is one of those ones where if you go talk to like our hardcore fans in our Discord, where they'll be like, oh, why are you doing this? Right. So I'm not trying to like give fuel to their fire, but one of the goals is to have a cooperative mode of play because it, you know, and we have prototypes of it. It works. It's really cool. We have the technology for it. It's fun. One of the challenges of a cooperative mode of play is depending on how the play works, if one thing that happens with the clock in Ur-Quan Masters is when you get into a conversation, the clock stops, right? Time stops marching forward. There's time dilation. When you get out of hyperspace, time stops marching, right? Time only advances in a certain way. If you're playing in co-op, and depending on the design of co-op, you could imagine how horrible that would be for the co-op experience, which is someone gets into a conversation, now I can't move because time can't advance. Or if I'm in a place where time does advance, like hyperspace, I'm not allowed to be there. So, I mean, simple design conceit is, well, you have to be in the same interplanetary, you have to visit the same star together, right? That is one possible design, which is you got to stick together a little bit. And then it's okay if one player gets into a conversation and the other player is, you know, strip mining a planet or whatever. So there's considerations for co-op, and that's a big part of it too. And then, yeah, it's player taste, it's considerations for cooperative play. And then really like, I was telling this to someone just last night, an artist, and I said, like, I don't look at, you know, old game conceits as like, oh, that's outdated. Oh, we shouldn't do that anymore or whatever. But more like, what do you get by doing that? And that's why I brought up calendaring games, because obviously there are tons of games that benefit from hard time limits. Can you create the drama of something bad about to happen without an actual calendar? Sure, the Comet in Final Fantasy VII, you know, whatever. You know, you can create the theater. You could argue, well, that's not as compelling as, oh my gosh, the clock ran out and all this stuff started happening. I mean, that's a powerful moment if you start seeing the Death March. To your point that you brought up too, though, it's like, how many players even see the Death March? How many players get to experience that? There's no one answer. There's just trade-offs. And so I guess to kind of leave you with some sort of an answer and say like, yeah, don't worry, we're thinking about it, is we're gonna see what gives us the strongest lever for the best experience. And that's a total dodge of the question, but it is, hey, there's a lot of factors in this. This is actually one of you asked two questions about, in my opinion, the two hardest parts for what we're doing. There's the beginning, and then there is, hey, how do you want to handle time and the player's relationship with time? There are games like Wildermyth, which have co-op, and they use a very board gamey time system where you have turns, you know, and it's like, okay, if you want to move to a new place, time advances, a month goes by, right? You know, very classic, like 4X kind of thing. That works too, you know? So it's thinking about it at a high level. How much is this getting us? What do we want the player relationship to be with it? How much of it can be smoke and mirrors? How much of it unlocks new gameplay and creates more fun? And that's really the latter part is the part that matters the most, is the thing that's going to be the most fun. I mean, again, easier said than done. The thing that's going to be the most fun and have the most impact, let's lean into that. And let's not like, oh, we kind of need this because it should be here and it's cool, but let's not leverage it for its advantages. Whereas I'd say, well, if time's a part of the game, let's make time really important. Let's make it really valuable. You know, Ur-Quan Masters, they're like, come back in 3 months, that kind of thing. So let's use that as a core atomic unit of how is this going to be really fun and cool? You know, lots of games have done that.
With Fallen Gods, we have a time limit, so it's a different kind of game because it's you're meant to play multiple runs. It's not, but each run is 90 days. And part of the logic of that is from a balance standpoint. I think this is a like endemic problem in computer role-playing games in particular. But that like it's very easy to play in a conservative way. You rest after every fight, you pre-buff before every fight, you return to town and dump all the loot and buy the best items you can every time, whatever. And to me, there's very little sense of adventure in that, but it's very hard not to play that way because people want to win and there's this desire to dominate the game that pushes you in that direction. So for instance, there's a series of games, Jeff Vogel's first, he called it Exiled in Avernum and something else, but it's the same series of games remade many times. And when I used to play that, I would play in this neurotic, degenerate way of, ferrying bags of grain back and forth from the dungeon, which weighed 20 pounds and sold for 2 gold because I wanted to get every piece of gold possible. So this is something we really wanted to avoid with Fallen Gods. The time limit creates this forward impetus that, yeah, sure, you can rest for 3 days to recover all your health, but you've now spent, 3.3% of your time to win the game recovering your health. You might rather spend that time exploring more, going into a dungeon, whatever it is. But we too find in player testing that there are players who are so committed to the idea of diligently vacuuming the map, picking up every mineral on every planet, whatever it is, that for them, the time limit is inherently frustrating, even when it is the whole point, right? The whole point is come up with a strategy to win within 90 days. There isn't any other point to the game. And so if you eliminate the time limit, everyone would win every single time. But nevertheless, it is a difficult dynamic to work with it. And I can only imagine with multiplayer, yeah, I guess even you have this additional issue of if it's a resource that players are able to spend separately, but they're from a common pool, you have like a tragedy of the commons situation, like all I was trying to do was gather minerals and you just spent 10% of our time flying around the map for no reason.
Yep. Yeah. So it's one of those like cool discoveries we're on right now. And there are so many answers to it. There's space gamey answers. FTL is a great example. A jump is an atomic unit of time and it changes. The pressure of a clock, and even what you're saying, like the point of this is a time limit. That's one thing. Majora's Mask, Outer Wilds, right? Games that embrace the time loop, and say I think for for me, it's the communication with the player about just what you said. What is the point of this? Why are you doing this? And why are you here? And being, I don't want to say flexible, but being clear and concise about that so that if a player, I think one important part of our game in Ur-Quan Masters is players get to play the way they want. And in some cases, a time limit might put the kibosh on that in a bad way. And we don't know yet, is the real true honest answer. But I tend to, especially with modern tastes, think, well, we need to support different play styles. Ur-Quan Masters let you beat the game with almost no combat if you wanted, right? For example, and that sort of sense of agency, if I get to do what I want, is really useful if you couple it with a time limit. It's just, what's the communication about that time limit? How does the player learn about it? Is it a mystery? Is it something exposed? So many questions. But yeah, well, speaking of time limit, we've also been talking for a while, so like I appreciate a ton of your time here. So probably should start winding down here, but I just wanted to give you an opportunity to say, like, did you have like any last questions, anything you wanted to ask while before we retreat into our dark caverns of gloom and glowing screens?
Well, the reality is I haven't followed you guys have started sharing a lot more information. I mean, there was a lot of just sharing of how the mechanics of the melee system worked, but I haven't seen the latest tranche of stuff. Do you guys have like a roadmap towards release? And I will say, one thing I've learned is every game takes 10 times longer. Even if you start by saying, okay, I'm going to multiply my expectation by 10, it'll still take 10 times longer than what you multiplied it to. Yeah. But are you guys in a position where you can do what we've done with Fallen Gods, since it's a hobby for me, is just say it'll take as long as it takes? Or do you guys have some plan? Okay, we've got to get it done in 3 years, or how does that look on from where you guys are?
Fred, do you want to? Yeah, do you take it?
We don't have a hard end set yet, but we would like to uh finish this production in our lifetimes.
People have waited long enough,
Yeah.
I think that's not something we've sort of shared publicly, like, oh, like a release date, that kind of stuff. That's not something we're ready to share. But a big motivator for us is to get playable things for people, and people, yeah, it is half a joke, but it's also true, especially if you play the Ur-Quan Masters. You've been waiting a while, like, hey, let's get this thing out there. But one other aspect, and there's still questions about how to do this, and I'm sure you've thought about all this stuff too, and maybe you've even had experiences with it, which is, hey, modern game development means you can still put out an atomic unit of a fun game and say it's done, but continue to work on it and continue to add the things you didn't get to. And there's lots of ways to do that. So, but I think, like, for Fred and I, and correct me if I'm wrong, Fred, but like, we're pretty motivated to get something out there into players' hands on a timeline. And my go-to phrase is work expands to fill the space you give it. It's not my phrase, but it's just like you said with the 10 times. My own estimation strategy is take however long I think it's going to take and multiply it by 3, just in case you want to use my numbers ever. But the point is, more useful than saying, oh, do a time estimation on it is, well, how long do I have to get something done? And what's the most important thing to get done? And what's really required? And what are the unknowns? And how long can the unknowns wait? And then, before I came back to game development, I was a project manager. And so maybe I speak like it sometimes, but it was the goal here is, hey, a lot of games can get mired. I mean, there's no wrong way to do it. If you want to spend, like, I love, like, Caves of Cut is a great example. I think they're going to work on that game forever. And that's like a passion project and a hobby. But an important part of them working on it forever is you can still play it now, right? And that's cool. So the melding, there's no like hard line between, oh, it's done and I can't work on it anymore. You don't have to do that. So I would say, like, Fred and I are both pretty motivated to say, hey, we want something that people can play. That's important driver for us. Cool. So thank you. Yeah, thank you for so much of your time. But I mean, I'm sort of speaking for Fred here, but like, thank you for all your kind words too. And like, it's really
Yeah.
cool to hear the impact
Very
it
nice
had on
meeting
you.
you too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I count myself very lucky. They say never meet your heroes. I've had the opportunity to meet many of my game development heroes, and they've all been remarkable people, generous with their time and knowledge and mentorship. So thank you guys for this opportunity to talk with you. I hope continue developing games that give homage to the great games of my childhood, and I look forward to finally getting a proper sequel to Ur-Quan Masters. It better be good. This is what I'm
Okay.
gonna tell you. If it's
All right.
terrible, I'm never talking to you again. Because
Fred, write that down. I was thinking it didn't need to be good, but maybe I'm off track here.
I mean, that is like it's not, of course, it's not going to be the game I imagined at 12, but I'm optimistic it will be a game that brings me back to that feeling I had when I was 12, like Ur-Quan Masters. So
Yeah, we hope so.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys very much, and hope we talk again some other time.
Yeah, definitely.